In 2011, flight attendants at Alaska Airlines received what was supposed to make their working lives easier: new uniforms. The producer spouted a lot of high-performance features of the new clothes: light polywool blends to replace their heavy all-wool counterparts, wrinkle-free button-down shirts, and a stain-proof finish to help the employees look crisp and professional at all times. One of those 2,800 employees getting a new work uniform was John, a man in his mid-50s at the time with over 25 years experience as a flight attendant, a 5th-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and a loving partnership with Marco. Neither of them could have foreseen what the next decade would have in store for them. But before we get ahead of ourselves, what exactly is high performance or functional clothing? I couldn't find an official definition of the phrase, so for the purposes of this video, we will define high-performance clothing as any type of clothing where there is an additional feature attached to the garment, in addition to the features that are brought by the textile fibers themselves, synthetic or natural. This additional feature is usually advertised as something desirable. Common phrases include sweat wicking, water repellent, antimicrobial, flame retardant, quick drying, shrink resistant, stain repellent. The list just goes on. Untreated natural fibers do have some of those features too, or you could treat it like a wool jacket treated with wax to make it more water repellent. But in our fast fashion bloated world, features like these are almost always caused by some sort of chemical treatment to the textile or the garment. Shoes and other textiles too, with Gore-Tex being a very common example of using Teflon coating, another word for polytetrafluoroethylene, or one of the many PFAS compounds floating about in the environment and an industrial favorite. But yeah, Gore-Tex uses Teflon to make their products water repellent. We can generally assume that brands are going to want to advertise those features to us, as it would make little sense for them to spend money and time adding these extra chemicals if there was not a reason to do so. But what does that mean for you? Well, it could mean that your local firefighters have their safety gear doused in toxic fire retardants like PFAS. Firefighters are a group of people who are already at higher risk of cancer due to inhaling smoke from all manner of things like plastics, electronics, paints, and fire suppression chemicals. So why not up the ante by putting toxins that have been found to disrupt hormones in their safety gear as well? And I don't really feel like I can add all the references to this video because there are just so many of these studies, and reference bloat is real. Not that this video is not subject to that anyway, but I think it is really upsetting how we as societies and companies, through lobbying, are poisoning professionals of what is still a dangerous profession, especially one where they frequently risk their own life to save others. PFAS are also very popular in water-repellent outdoor gear, to the point where Korean researchers were able to correlate the blood concentration levels of participants with how often they wore said outdoor gear, as well as finding levels at and around the various campsites at Mount Everest, which is far from the only way mountaineers and other enthusiasts are polluting the very environment in which they enjoy to roam. Often these same people advocate for environmental protection as well and may be unaware that they themselves may be a source of contamination to their beloved environment, as their high-tech gear sheds microfibers coated with the stuff, and PFAS itself leaches off the textiles and into the surroundings. But when we look at it, studies have found that using PFAS as the water repellency coating in so much of our outdoor gear is substantially over-engineered, and there are significant benefits, not to mention loss of toxicity, by switching to wax-based and non-fluorinated finishes for the majority of us. After all, do we really need gear so extreme it would keep us safe at the summit of Mount Everest just to take us to and from work? The same applies even more to skiers and snowboarders, where waxes containing PFAS are routinely used to improve glide, affecting both the person waxing their equipment and the environment they move within. And then that pollution spreads further through meltwater and atmospheric distribution. And if you think you're safe from PFAS exposure because you don't engage in outdoor activities, I am sorry to have to disappoint you. PFAS are one of the groups of what we call forever chemicals in environmental chemistry, on account of them not really breaking down in nature and their hormone disrupting potential, and they have been found all over the world. At this point, we assume that something like 99% of humans, or practically everyone, and most of the surface level of our planet is contaminated in some way, shape, or form, to the extent that whatever the toxic effects will turn out to be, it is just yet another thing we have to learn to live with from this generation onwards. I made another video addressing PFAS specifically that I will link below if you are more interested in learning about that. Yeah, hi. I make a chaotic mixture of heavily researched textile science videos and craft projects, often with feline assistance. If you're new here, welcome. I have so many receipts because this video has literally been in my to finally wrestle into a video list for years. Like, subscribe if that is your jam, I don't know. One of the reasons I started making videos rather than pursuing more academics was literally because a lot of what we're talking about today has been known within academia for decades. But I find that the general public does not know, and I want to try to change that. And it is not as if climate scientists tend to overplay their results or their potential effects. If anything, climate scientists especially have been found to grow ever more conservative and more cautious in their predictions and in presenting their results, because the blowback from science-denying politicians and the public has just gotten so harsh and so ruthless. And scientists are human too, like getting a deluge of hate will deter most people from wanting to stick their hand into a wasp's nest again, even if you really believe in what you do. Like, it's hard. We are far from done though. Did you know that chrome-tanned leather, which stands for between 85 to 90% of the leather making industry, is so toxic that leather waste and leather products, including your bag, belt, shoes, or other leather items you may have, are classified as hazardous waste in large parts of the world? I happen to have a video about that too, although that one is more of a comparison between animal-based leather and synthetic leather-like products. What can I say other than the library is growing? And while legislation for babies and toddlers is a little bit better, as in there is actually some legislation for them, whereas for adults things are rather unmanaged, that is not to say things are perfect in any way, shape, or form. A study published in 2025, for instance, found that 80% of the infant clothing they sampled exceeded Oeko-Tex limits for arsenic, cadmium, and chromium, with dark-colored synthetic fabrics presenting the highest risk. Which is a thing we find again and again, like more saturated, more chemicals, higher risk. We've also found formaldehyde in both infant clothing and clothing marketed towards pregnant people. In the industry, formaldehyde is commonly used to, among other things, make clothes and fibers that wrinkle less and do not really have to be ironed. The same is true for wrinkle-resistant linen or cotton shirts. It is typically going to be formaldehyde that is responsible for that effect. And it is one of the few textile treatment chemicals that have been thoroughly established as a potential allergen through skin contact. Although we know that any chemical can potentially trigger an allergic reaction. Access to safer clothing is, as usual, also linked to parents' socioeconomic status, and not only what kind of clothing they can afford for their child, but also how much time they have to investigate safe options, or even just the time to watch videos like these, letting them know that they may want to pay attention to what they probably thought was just inert. I mean, it's just clothes, right? And it is not as if we don't have documented instances of people getting sick from skin contact with chemicals added to textiles almost a century ago, right? And more than that with arsenic dresses too, but I digress. But back to John and his colleagues at Alaska Airlines. It didn't take long before some of the flight attendants started complaining about the new uniforms giving them a rash. Some were also struggling with breathing problems, red eyes, runny noses, brain fog, headaches, and more. John himself wore the new uniform on January 2011 and had to be taken to the emergency room upon landing with blisters on his arms and severely compromised breathing. But at the time, no one had really heard of anyone getting sick from clothing beyond the occasional rash, so doctors didn't really have a lot of experience or knowledge to go on. When John put the uniform on again in early March, he broke out in hives and couldn't breathe within minutes. It wouldn't take long before the industrial hygienist at the Association of Flight Attendants, Judith Anderson, started receiving a whole lot more emails and calls about attendants having nasty reactions to their new uniforms. But when the company sent samples back to the uniform producer for testing, the results came back that there were no foreign chemicals in the uniforms, meaning that all the chemicals that had been added were there on purpose. Not only that, but they were all within the safety limits of the meager guidelines we have for clothing. So how could it be that John and several of his colleagues were having some really serious reactions as soon as they put those uniforms on, or spent time around colleagues wearing their uniforms, but no safety guideline had been exceeded? If you've been around this channel for some length of time, you may or may not remember a video from 2025 where I talked about something known as the cocktail effect, which is very simply that combinations of chemicals will tend to behave differently than the sum of their parts, especially when they are working inside a living, breathing, complex organism full of hormone pathway, biofeedback effects, and just so many specialized cells, proteins, and processes, many of which are so specialized that just isomers, that is, chemicals that have the same base elements in them but are a little bit differently oriented, can still create very different medical effects in a human body. I would venture that you could probably ask any doctor, nurse, pharmacist, dentist, or other healthcare professional, and they will be able to tell you that different medications interact with one another in sometimes wildly unpredictable ways and must be closely monitored to avoid patients having adverse effects if two or more meds do not play nice together. This is one of the reasons many people on antidepressants are advised to avoid grapefruit, or why ADHD drugs and alcohol can have, let's just say, undesirable effects. But to the body, there is no difference between a medication you take daily and the PFAS you absorb through your skin from your jacket, save for the mode of delivery in this case. They are both external chemicals that the body must figure out what to do with. In addition, the body only has so many resources to commit to metabolizing or excreting toxins at any given time. This is also one of the reasons why one of the treatments for acute methanol poisoning is to add ethanol to the mix as well. The enzyme that metabolizes methanol to formaldehyde is called alcohol dehydrogenase, and then it transforms formaldehyde to formic acid through formaldehyde dehydrogenase. But this enzyme prefers ethanol over methanol, which gives the body enough time to deal with the formic acid buildup, hopefully before blindness and death sets in. In the same way, we can think of the liver's capacity to flush toxins out of our systems as a finite resource, one that can be overwhelmed both by the sheer number or amount of a single toxin, but also the sum total of lots of tiny amounts of different toxins. And I kind of regret having to be the one to tell you this, but our current system of assessing whether a chemical is safe or not, as well as our legal system deciding if harm has actually happened or not, is almost always focused on only the first of the two, the one high amount of toxin harming the body, not lots of tiny toxins working together. Even new medications, which are some of the most expensive and time-consuming, but also potentially the most lucrative chemicals to develop, only do medical trials, assuming they are the only drug in the body unless there is a very good reason not to. If there are dangerous interactions between other chemicals or meds, or we start seeing that it is not breaking down in nature and might be having a harmful effect on wildlife, that will not be discovered until much, much later, and in patients' case, usually only when people start reporting side effects to their doctors. Even safe release levels, which dictate how much of a troublesome chemical can be released into the environment by industry actors, are set based on single chemical at a time models and tests. Why? Because there are thousands upon thousands of chemicals being produced in the world today, and even testing a drug against a tiny fraction of the most problematic or highest production volume of chemicals would be prohibitively, exponentially expensive and experimentally really complicated. I provide some additional maths in that video about cocktail effects, so do check that out if you want to learn more. Because I have finally realized that there will never be just one video to rule them all when it comes to this topic. It is simply just too large. So, in essence, John and his unfortunate colleagues were subjected to a set of clothing where most of the pieces had at least one functional or high-performance element added to the textile. And even though none of those chemicals were above what we think are safe-ish release levels, and don't get me started on how arbitrary those limits are, because that is a whole different kind of mess. Just the fact that the industry themselves set or suggest these limits in the first place is a whole set of wasps' nests that we just cannot get into right now. There were simply so many of these different functional chemicals, that it became a case of death by 1,000 cuts. Not for all the flight attendants, but certainly for a large enough number of them to warrant concern. Because adverse reactions are one of the ways our bodies try to tell us to avoid certain things or certain areas. And when we don't or can't listen, and we expose ourselves to those same things again and again, despite the body trying to tell you to knock it off, our bodies may react faster and faster, as well as more violently, to get us to stop seeking out the adverse exposure that is making us sick. And one of the quote-unquote endpoints when a system gets exposed to a lot of potential allergens over a period of time, for some unfortunate people, is multiple chemical sensitivity, where the body starts reacting as if almost everything is an allergen and is a threat to the body, and this makes just existing day to day for the person suffering from it really difficult and isolating. A study from Harvard found that the rate of multiple chemical sensitivity, as well as other reactions like itchy skin, hives, loss of voice, shortness of breath, and blurred vision, more or less doubled before and after the new uniforms were introduced, despite both the airline executives and the uniform producer digging their heels in and gaslighting the flight attendants for being too sensitive. And just to be clear, Alaska Airlines were not the only company facing challenges regarding toxic uniforms. Both American Airlines, which used the same uniform provider, and Delta, which used a different company, all had reports of similar issues when they introduced more new uniforms. And as canaries in the metaphorical coal mine goes, it turns out flight attendants are a surprisingly controlled group of unintentional participants when it comes to the effect of chemicals in clothing. They are in their uniforms all day, in cramped cabins with air circulating continuously, and really long cross-continental flights of 10 hours or more in those same uniforms are not unheard of. Then they collapse in a hotel bedroom before getting up to do it all over again. In American Airlines' case, one of the chemicals they found to be especially problematic was, yet again, formaldehyde. I don't know what to tell you. We just keep using it. Everyone loves wrinkle-resistant clothing. So where does that leave you as a lonesome, overwhelmed textile consumer? Most of us in the wealthier parts of Europe and America are not working directly in or around textile mills with all the adverse health risks that entails, although if we think of all human beings as well as nature as having intrinsic value just by existing, that should also raise cause for concern no matter where the suffering is happening. Perhaps you argue that you only have a few items of clothing that were advertised as high functional or high performance. Surely you are safe then, right? After all, here I am emphasizing that a large part of the issue is the exposure of a whole host of many different chemicals. So if I just have one or two items, that should be safe, right? Well, as with most things, it isn't quite that simple. And first of all, while this video tries to focus on clothing marketed as functional or high performance, those are far from the only chemicals we add to clothing, nor are they the only potentially dangerous ones. I assume that most of you are not wearing exclusively undyed clothes, nor have most of you spun or woven your own fabric for most of the clothing in your wardrobe. I would venture as a guess, as an assumption, which are both processes where chemicals are used to various extent. A lot of especially synthetic fibers do not take dye from natural dyeing methods, and some of the cheapest and most easily accessible dyes that work on synthetic fibers are a group known as azo dyes. This group of chemicals are contested enough to require a video in and of themselves, but suffice to say that they have been found to be largely unhealthful, to put it mildly, and since this video focuses on clothes, I haven't even mentioned how most of us are exposed to chemicals all day, every day, from cars, phones, furniture, paint, sprays, plastic, toys, curtains, etc., etc. And I think that especially in the Eurocentric world and science model that encourages us to look at ourselves as separate from nature, it is important to remember that we are mammals on this good earth too. And what harms wild mammals through environmental contamination that just hangs around in the background environment and just kind of leaches into pristine environment as the chemicals around us try to reach an equilibrium in the atmosphere and sea, those chemicals will also harm us. Often these chemicals harm us more because we are closer to the sources of contamination with, our love for new cars, techs, house renovations and cosmetics, which regularly puts us in environments that display significantly higher levels of contamination than distant regions and nature reserves. Not to mention how past pollution and exposure typically affects at-risk and marginalized groups more, as poor areas are often established close to less desirable industrial areas in a city and old waste dumping sites. We already know that PFAS exposure is affecting not just wildlife, but us as well, and perhaps it seems especially the male reproductive system. Scandinavian men have some of the lowest sperm counts in the world, and it could be that our wealth and love for new tech could be partially to blame. And while it was somewhat slow to gain momentum, we are finally starting to see studies focusing on not just how individual chemicals used in the textile industry can be harmful to us and the planet, but also how some of those factors work together in ways that increase their toxic effects.
Are we not part of this world?
The textile industry is complicated, but being complicated is not a reason not to try to regulate it. Rather the opposite. And we already know that consumer education and community efforts are having an impact on the industry, such as a Swedish survey experiment showing that consumers had an increased willingness to pay for clothes with alternative waterproofing finishes when they were educated about some of the hazards related to PFAS production and exposure. Another study looked into how phase-outs of problematic chemicals happen within an industry and how it is rarely just one company moving first, but rather many actors following trends and each other. There is also, of course, the discussion of what PFAS-based treatments should be replaced with, as we have multiple examples of the industry replacing a problematic chemical with one that in the long term turns out to be just as problematic or worse. We even saw this within PFAS itself, where it started with a carbon-8 PFAS, so that is like 8 carbons on a string with the fluor around them, and they thought that the long chains were more problematic, so they swapped to shorter chains, so fewer carbons in a line, still with fluor around them, to say that they were not treating it with PFOA or Teflon, and it turned out that the short-chained PFAS compounds were similarly problematic, if not more, than the original compounds. So we see this all the time. Another study looked into Patagonia and their complicated relationship with branding themselves as green and different, with the author remarking that an issue we see elsewhere is, branding yourself as a sustainable or green choice may increase sales, but increased sales and consumption are also directly linked to asking more of our planet than she can feasibly regrow before we need more again. Which is why I prefer recommending people to use what they already have or what already exists from secondhand shops, rather than looking for the perfect green solution, which often does not exist. Like, there's not one solution that fits everyone in the whole world because there are so many local variations. I think there are many different approaches we can take to try to address some of these issues. One piece of legislation that I think sounds really promising comes from the Netherlands, where new legislation came into effect in 2025 that basically bans not just the current addictive designer drugs that we know of, but also new, not yet discovered designer drugs in the same family that are being developed in the future and, will have similar effects. As far as I am aware, this is the first legislation of its kind to target a whole group of chemicals rather than a single chemical at a time, and I see great potential for harm reduction if similar efforts were made around families of forever chemicals that just refuse to break down in nature, and where we know beyond reasonable doubts that similar chemicals would also probably share similar problematic features. Of course, this is the kind of thing that needs careful thinking when phrasing and establishing what constitutes as a boundary for belonging to one chemical class over another, but we have many clever people working really hard to try to solve such conundrums and to make life better for all of us. Just don't forget that us analytical chemists also need companies to produce analytical standards of those very same chemicals we seek to monitor. It should be easy enough to distinguish between production in the tens of tons range and the tens of grams required for analysis, though, but stranger things have happened at the stroke of a pen. I also think that we can take steps as communities and as consumers if we start to ask for and look for companies and people who have a more holistic view of our beautiful planet and the creatures and fellow human beings we share this pale blue dot with. In permaculture, for instance, they do not consider money or, property the only form of wealth worth building or the only form of wealth that exists. There is also intellectual capital, social capital, health and living capital, cultural, spiritual, or experimental, as well as financial and material capital, all working together to form a cohesive sum of personal and environmental wealth. I think that if we can encourage and support companies that treat their employees fairly, but also look at its fellow humans not just as potential money earned, but full human beings whose health and thriving is deeply tied to our own, then maybe we could start getting somewhere. And if you or a loved one struggle with textile sensitivity, you probably already know that pale or undyed garments are slightly less likely to be triggering, but beyond asking textile and clothing companies to list all the chemicals used in the production process on the garment tag, there is precious little we can do to know in advance whether a garment will cause a reaction or not. So far, we have seen one airline company successfully being sued by their employees for making them wear uniforms that made them sick. In this case, flight attendants from American Airlines were able to argue that their formaldehyde-treated gear gave them severe health issues, probably largely helped by them managing to identify formaldehyde as one of the main issues. We still have no system that is able to deal with a combination of many small amounts of chemicals being the issue itself without any one chemical being identified as the main culprit or found in levels proven to cause risk of harm. Which again, these studies are done on a single chemical at a time, not multiple chemicals acting together, which is what our actual lived environment looks like. Sadly, these news would come too late for John, who passed away due to complications in February of 2021, almost 10 years to the dot from the first time he put on the uniform that would forever destroy his health and his life. Other flight attendants have had to move to the desert, where there are fewer potential triggers and the strong UV rays from the sun break chemicals down faster than many other places. People have lost their health, their energy, their partners, and yes, sometimes their lives. Some of the older generations love to point out how conditions like asthma and allergies were a lot less prevalent in their day than they are now. But the world also looks a whole lot different now than it did back then. The enormous boom in decades of chemical developments and synthetic processes have introduced an enormous array of chemicals to us and our environment that simply were not there generations ago. We do not inhabit the same world at all. Even if we stopped all chemical release and production tomorrow, which of course we can't, we and all generations who come after us will still have to figure out how to live in this world that we drastically changed. A world where the consequences of our actions and of the chemicals we have produced and released into the world are still not fully known or understood. But to take an anecdote from my own struggles with chronic migraines, it is not a huge cognitive leap to see that if I sleep poorly or otherwise disrupt my routine, my migraine trigger glass, if you will, is already half full, and it takes a lot less for other triggers to pull me all the way into a full-blown migraine episode. And with that same way of thinking, by having increased our background contamination of potentially harmful chemicals in the world, that means our body is a little bit preoccupied all the time. It makes sense that our bodies could be more susceptible to develop allergies, autoimmune diseases, or other chronic illnesses when that has become the status quo. I don't have a source for that, that's just me theorizing. I'll be curious to see what science finds in the decades to come. And although teams of lawyers and marketing professionals are trying to gaslight us into believing that people like John just happen to be more sensitive than the average person, please do not believe them. These people are the canaries in the chemical coal mine. Already, scientists are finding human-made chemicals that do not break down in a timely fashion in the furthest reaches of the planet, including Antarctica and deep seas. We cannot undo that. This is something we have now etched into the history of our world. And the tragedy really is seeing that even if the clothing companies had our best interest at heart and not just their next quarter report, the very chemicals they claim make our lives so much easier may in fact be doing anything but. This video has been brought to you by viewers like you. Thank you so much to Patreon members, young and old, who have so patiently waited as I have repeatedly talked about wanting to do a video about this topic, but getting it pushed back again and again. I am not kidding when I say that I have wanted to make a video about this for years, ever since I picked up To Die For by Alden Wicker a few years ago. Do recommend. References to that and all the other things mentioned in this video, of course, will be in the description box below. Probably a link to my website, because I'm pretty sure we exceeded the YouTube description character limit with this one. Such is life. Honestly, I only managed to start chipping away at this enormous topic when I realized that there will never be a one-and-done video about the enormous topic that is toxic chemicals in clothing. There is so much we haven't covered yet, and that deserves future attention, but I just simply cannot jam all of it into a single video. So more and different angles to come as I gather enough references to figure out different ways to frame and articulate different points and topics. Again, a big thank you to our generous Patreon community. I know many of you are especially interested to hear more of the sciencey videos, and I make fewer of them than I would like, but perhaps we could change that. If you like this video and would like to see more videos like it, perhaps consider liking and subscribing. And if you really like what I do, maybe consider becoming a patron. But that's it for this time. I hope you don't feel too disillusioned with the world to the point that you want to give up, though if you do feel anxious, I have been reading A Field Guide to Climate Anxiety by Sarah Jaquette Ray and can recommend for getting that old nervous system a little bit unstuck again. We can make a change, especially as a community. The world is all made up of various groups of people forming different kinds of communities with different levels and types of power, and there is simply no reason why we cannot start talking to friends and slowly beginning to build the kind of social capital that can change the world. Believing in and envisioning the kind of world we want to build is often half the battle. Please take care for now. Bye.